Hi, everyone. Welcome to our discussion about A Man on the Inside, the new Netflix TV show about a private investigator in San Francisco who hires a very unusual assistant to help her conduct an undercover investigation of a retirement home in San Francisco. My name is Stephen Lee, and I'm a lawyer in Chicago who used to be a federal prosecutor and who used to be a newspaper reporter. So I think a lot about investigations and how to do them better as part of my job. So after I watched the show, which my wife and I loved, I thought about writing something about A Man Inside. And then I realized, wait a second, I actually know three real life private investigators in San Francisco. And so I thought it'd be fun to get us all together to talk about what it really is like to be a private investigator and how they would actually have done this operation if they had been the ones hired by Julie's client. So with me is Stacy Drescher, Avi Klein, and Bruce Gersman. So let me just see if all of them can just introduce themselves. Let's start with Stacy.
Great. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. Hello. So apologies, my voice is a bit difficult because I'm getting over a cold. I've been a PI since 2006, but I went to law school. I was a litigator in my prior life. Before that, I was in human rights and work. And I became a PI when I hired a former corporate intelligence firm that I worked at for 15 years because I thought what they did was way more interesting than being a litigator. And I was in-house counsel there, so I did a lot of saying no to things to make sure we colored within the lines. And now I have my own firm. There are about 7 of us, and we're both lawyers and PIs who do workplace investigations. That the attorneys do those, and also fact gathering and business intelligence gathering for lawyers and decision makers.
Great. Avi?
Thank you, Stephen. Really nice to be here. Thanks for having me. I too am a local private investigator. I actually used to work with Stacy, and learned a lot from Stacy. I have my own shop now, centered in Oakland, and I work mainly on complex business litigation disputes and what I call criminal defense matters. And before that, I was in politics and in journalism. Like all of us, I think I just come from a world of figuring stuff out. That's what I do every day.
Great. And Bruce?
And hi, yep, Bruce Gersman. I'm with Waterfront Intelligence. That's a firm I run in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I'm very happy to be friends with both Stacy and Avi. We connect regularly, and yeah, we find all kinds of evidence for all kinds of litigation cases, criminal and civil, and we do work throughout the country.
Okay, great. Okay, so let's talk about A Man on the Inside. We've all seen the show, and the core premise of the show is that basically Julie gets hired to figure out who stole his client's mother's jewelry. And she decides to do this by sending in an undercover operative, Charles, played by Ted Danson. Okay, so first big question for the group. Is that how you would have conducted this investigation if you had been hired? Would you have sent in an undercover agent into the retirement home? Anyone?
The answer is no. But Hollywood's way more interesting when you do it their style than you do it our way. I would say we're all nerds, and we like to figure things out behind the scenes.
Okay. All right.
But I'll let my comrades speak.
Avi, Bruce?
I think what I would say about it is that, first of all, that's an incredibly expensive way. Setting aside there's ethical issues involved here, but as a first shot at trying to solve the problem, hiring someone, I mean, forget about the expense of you have to sign the contract for the room in the retirement community. I think everyone who's ever had any experience with that knows that that is just in itself an incredibly expensive beast that, the client is going to have to pay for that room and board and all those drinks and everything, plus the hourly rate. I mean, one of the things that I thought was so funny about all that in the show is there's one scene in one of the first episodes where Julie, the private investigator who hires Ted Danson, gives him a hard time because he wants to expense a $100 electric blanket. And I'm just thinking, are you nuts? Let him have the electric blanket. This thing is costing your client tens of thousands of dollars a week to run it. And, I think the better approach for the sophisticated investigator is always to try to get the right answer, but to do it within a budget that's reasonable considering the circumstances and the value of the thing here at stake. And I think the better approach, perhaps at the beginning, would have been: could you background check key players to try to identify local likely suspects, or interview people who are members of the community, not by sneaking in, but by trying to develop sources inside who would be willing to talk to you, former employees who might have be willing to tell you, oh yeah, there was always that guy who was causing those problems, or something like that. But said, at least would not categorically say I would not do something like this, but it would be far from the first thing that I would choose to do.
Okay.
Yeah,
Bruce?
also just to figure out the budget for something like this, I wouldn't even know exactly where to start, because spending a month doing something like this, um, it it's just hard to imagine all the expenses and being able to even make a profit off of doing this. But yeah, this would be probably my very, very last choice. And that's because every moment of the day, there's a risk, like a huge risk, like a risk of being caught and maybe getting in some kind of, civil trouble. Um, just by our guy being inside all the time, they're always being like, um, possibly looked at. And like what Avi said, there seemed to be a lot of choices beforehand, a lot of things we could do to, find the key people just to speak with them without having to actually live there and attempt to fool some. Um, and in this case, it was like this watch that was stolen. It seems that there are so many choices of different possible people to speak with who are just connected to that one victim, that we could, get some kind of statements from and then get leads from those people. So it would definitely be my last choice.
Okay, so let's start with
Steve,
the first. Oh, so
I was just going to add one more thing, and that is clients tend to think that PIs, that they think of the gun, they think of Hollywood. That's usually what most law, even sophisticated attorneys. You, as a former federal prosecutor, worked with FBI. You know what PIs do, but a lot of lawyers don't, and so they think that we're just like these gumshoes who can kind of go, boots on the ground, going. But I can tell you, almost every time someone calls me and says we want to do surveillance, I talk them off the ledge and say let's do all these other things, because one, like both Avi and Bruce said, it's expensive, but and the risks are higher, and so and the chance of success is so much lower. And so that's just the. I'll let you ask your next
Yeah,
question
okay.
now.
So yeah, we've covered this a little bit. So okay, so what would you do? So what would you do? And let's give Julie a little bit of credit. Let's assume Julie might have done some of these things before calling in Charles, right? But just talk through some of the steps that so maybe each of you can talk through some of the steps you would have done at the beginning of this investigation. So Stacey, what about you? What would you have done first?
I think that we're all going to echo each other, and so and I don't tend to do these kind of cases, but if I did, the first thing, and I think Avi and Bruce are going to shake their head, is like, let's first look at Pacific View. Do they have a history of theft or issues? Are there online so just desktop research. Are there any online forums or social media, anything there that talks about potential theft issues? Any lawsuits? These are highly regulated. Retirement homes are highly regulated. We maybe even file for public records or FOIA requests trying to see like what investigations have been done of this company and of this particular facility. Then find former employees who work there, especially ones who may have sued them for wrongful termination or have beef against them. But once you pick up the phone and start talking to people, then it no longer, it kind of leaves the confidentiality realm. So you do take that risk. But I'm going to stop because I feel like I would just say everything and I want to give Avi and Bruce a chance to kind of yes and me, because this is what we do. We don't surface unless the client wants us to.
So maybe,
I think there's actually. Go ahead, Steve.
yeah. So I think that was helpful, maybe especially for people who are watching this. Like I think about investigations a lot as like there's a covert stage and there's an overt stage. Covert is the things you
Yes.
can do behind the scenes without really any risk of the people you're investigating finding out. And so I think that's a really big shift. So yeah, why don't we talk more? So Stacy was talking a bit about the desktop research. That definitely I think goes in the covert stage. Avi, anything more? Let's say maybe anything more in the covert stage that you would add to that.
I think what I would just add is that there's a really important linkage between those two stages, that they're not separate. And the first one is actually the key thing that informs the second. So that when you're going through these searches and you're doing these things that Stacy described, looking through social media or press reports or litigation or regulatory records, as she mentioned, is highly regulated. So Medicare and Medi-Cal and who knows what other types of agencies might have responded to complaints that you might find something useful. The whole time in any kind of investigation, you're keeping your eyes open, okay, both for the facts and for the allegations, but almost more importantly, you're looking for the names of people who you can call later. You can just circle it right now and go back to the client and say, okay, here's what we found out. And we have a list now of 5 people, former employers, former employees, or elderly people who sued them over a contract dispute over the terms of the lease at the retirement community or whatever it might be. And now we would like to call them, and here's why we think we can call these people. And we've organized these. These are the ones that I think are less likely to tip. These ones we might get this, but there is some risk because we're not exactly sure what the relationship is. But actually, you can't really do that second stage until you've really done the first stage correctly. Bruce.
Yeah, I feel like very similarly. The idea is at first to start with that background research, but yeah, to get the leads and to get the leads of people to speak with. And keeping in mind that like when we do eventually speak with people, we don't necessarily have to be asking them like giving them the like putting them under a light and saying, do you know who did this or did you do this? This is the kind of investigation where we could be asking sort of parallel questions that are not necessarily about this piece of jewelry. And then we're not necessarily giving ourselves up to the rumor mill and water cooler conversation and like the risks that any risks to the client that we're like accusing of stealing this jewelry.
Yeah, I think
I have
that's
one more thing to add, and this is just one more thing just to kind of in the covert stage. And that is, we're talking about a necklace. We don't know how much it's worth, but give it, let's just say for Hollywood purposes, it's like a $10,000 necklace, or something like that. There's the one of the things that we do as PIs when we're looking at a company on like who did it is who's living beyond their means or who's in financial disarray. So looking at the key employees, I don't know if there's 100 employees or who has access to the rooms, identifying them, and then who's bankruptcies, tax liens, judgments, foreclosures, or just who's complaining about their finances on social media, who's ranting about the government. So narrowing down the people by also looking at who's just bought a car that really could not have afforded that, Mustang. So there's that. Then the other thing is pawn shops. I would go to all the nearby and high-end pawn shops, because there are a bunch in San Francisco, and bring a picture and be like, do you have this necklace? I've been looking for this particular necklace. And then you can work your way back that way too. So without even having to pick up the phone, you're still doing the kind of gumshoe boots on the ground work, but it won't get back to them. The last thing I want to say is just go through the front door. What if we just called Pacific View and be like, this is happening. I've been hired. Let's keep this quiet and work together instead of this whole subterfuge.
Yeah, no, that's great. And that goes to some of the things that, like, basically in the day when I was a federal prosecutor, some of the things that we would look at a lot too, right? So Stacey, what Stacey was just talking about, we would call that unexplained wealth, right? If someone has suddenly, if suddenly they're buying expensive things, if suddenly they're posting on social media, things that go to wealth, and yet there's really nothing that explains it, well, that does suggest criminal activity, right? And that can be useful to prove it up. So that's great. Well, so one thought might be, it came up a little bit about talking to former employees. Let's talk about that a little bit. Why former employees? Bruce, can you maybe talk about that? Like, why do you go to those? What's special about former employees as opposed to other potential witnesses?
Well, on the practical side, they often don't have like they don't have a big dog in the fight. They don't have a whole lot to lose necessarily by speaking about something that's, going on at their former employer. And then, also and they also might have like some reason to want to talk negatively about either the former employer or their situation there. And then also from a legal point of view, um, in some instances, like an employee that's working someplace at the time has restrictions about what they can even say, and those are two, big reasons to go to the former, find and speak with the former employees.
Yeah. Okay. One thing also you guys said that I thought was really, I thought resonated with me was the idea of try to investigate one crime by investigating similar crimes. And I think one of you mentioned that too. It's like, might be really hard to figure out who stole this particular item. But once you realize if there were multiple thefts, it might be easier to solve one of those thefts and then lead you back to whoever stole the thing you really start off with. I think that comes up a lot in real life. Like, you can get away with one crime kind of easily, but it's hard to get away with others. Like, when I was prosecuting bank robbers in my early days as a prosecutor, well, one-time bank robbers really hard to catch. Fortunately, most people don't stop at one, and so you can catch them later on. Um, okay.
And with Stephen, on that note, like you could come into interviews with these parallel, like a parallel, entire parallel interviews, entire parallel questions. Like, I'm here really to speak about the the staff in general, or like the house cleaning in general, or like um how how a certain thing is kept up in this residence, and sort of be asking the questions down that line and somehow intersperse what you're really getting at.
Okay.
So
All right. So let's say Julie's done some of those things. Maybe it just happened between scenes and we didn't see that. And then maybe she decides, like, look, none of this stuff's really working. I'm not finding any former employees who have anything useful to say, not finding anything through the Freedom of Information Act requests, pawn shops, it's all dry. Okay. So then she's thinking about the undercover. So let's talk a little bit about that. Okay. Can you talk about, like, first of all, like, how do you use undercovers? Do you use undercovers in the course of your work? How do you do it? Have you ever done, what's the typical type of undercover thing? And then what's it like? Anything like this? So maybe start with Avi this time.
Sure. I have not used undercovers extensively, but I have used them, small and medium-sized things. And actually, I did one last year. It did not involve a retirement community, but it involved a karaoke location in the Bay Area where the landlord was very concerned because these people were getting lots of complaints about violating the law. They were allowing smoking indoors, they were cooking, they weren't allowed to be cooking. All this was wafting into the businesses of all the neighboring tenants who were complaining. They wanted them evicted. They needed to get evidence, and they had already hired a private investigator to look into it. And they sent a middle-aged white guy like me who went out one night, and he knocked on the door and he wanted to go in and they wouldn't let him in. And he stood outside in the parking lot for 2 hours billing time and had nothing to show for it at the end. So then the client called me and said, okay, well, that didn't work. Can you figure something out? And so on this show that we're talking about, they put a post on Craigslist, I think, or something like that. Well, I posted it on to our equivalent of that, which is the listserv for the California Association of Licensed Investigators, which is just an all-purpose. You can just find a private investigator to help you with anything. And I found a Chinese American out of San Francisco who actually knew all about this club. And he knew the whole thing. And he's like, no, you're never getting it in there. This is only for Chinese people. You have to make a reservation long ahead of time. You come in a group. You got to pay for the B-girls. You got to do a whole thing if you want to do that. And I ran it by the client, and we got a budget. And I sent this guy and two of his friends to go have a huge night at this karaoke club. And they had a grand old time. I said to him, by the way, do you smoke cigarettes? He said, no. And I said, okay, well, you're going to smoke cigarettes because we got to prove that they're going to allow you to smoke cigarettes in there, and you're going to get the girls and the whole thing. And it was very, very successful and got everything the client wanted. And then I had an expense report at the end, which had incredible line items like cigarettes, $10, tips to the mama-san, $200 because you got to tip out to her, B-girl expenses, $450, and the client paid the whole bill.
Okay, very, very funny, very funny.
You got to find the key to the whole thing is one, this was a licensed private investigator who did the work. Stacey alluded at the very beginning of our conversation that one of the things that was just completely illegal about this whole operation on the show is that you can't just hire a random person to go and do a project like that. You need someone who is licensed, and you need the right person for the right job. And I'm a very good private investigator in some circumstances, and I'm a terrible private investigator and the wrong person in a whole lot of other circumstances. And what makes me and Stacey and Bruce effective in the work that we do is that we know how to very quickly find the right person for the right gig. And that's going to be how you set it up for success every single time.
Great.
Yeah, an investigator's only as good as their network, to be honest, and their reputation. But there's a couple of things here, legally wise. One, when I hire an employee, the employee doesn't have to be a licensed PI. They work under my license as a qualified manager. Private investigators are licensed by the state, just like lawyers. You can't go and be a California lawyer and just walk into Kansas and say, here I am, I'm going to put out my shingle. Same with PIs. We have to be licensed where our feet are. And there's workarounds, and there's, you go to the agency that regulates it. You can sometimes get a 30-day pass. There's all these things, but that's not. But the issue is that if you use a subcontractor or an independent contractor, they need to be licensed separately. You can't just get someone off the street. And so a lot of PIs break this law, and it's really scary if you think about you having someone making phone calls or, doing something overt and they're not licensed. So that's one. The second is pretexting is a very big no-no. But what I thought was interesting about this case is Charles did not pretext. His wife had passed away. He was a former professor at Berkeley. He did have a daughter named Emily, who the PI became the daughter. Like, all these things. There were definitely omissions and lies, and the PI, he broke the law in this PI statute. But nonetheless, he didn't pretext. He just didn't say certain things like, "I have a home in the Berkeley Hills," blah blah.
Right.
But
Well, let's talk a little bit more about that, and then I do want to get more of your general experience with undercovers. But let's talk about that a little bit. What Charles did, Charles getting hired. I mean, that was the thing that kind of hit me. Like, is this even okay? I don't think they can even do this, right? I mean, because he's not a licensed private investigator. It happens very quickly. I don't think there's enough time. I don't know how long it takes to become a licensed private investigator, but I don't think it doesn't seem like they had enough time in the show to make that happen. So legally, I think that's very problematic. But talk about this. So that's one issue. But can you explain, what do you mean by pretexting? What's pretexting?
Pretexting is using a false identity to gain access or information that you wouldn't gain if you were honest. So I want to go back to Avi's example of the karaoke bar. That is a public place. Granted, you need to know how to get in, but this person who used probably their real name, maybe they use a fake email, who cares? They went in through the front door. I've gone undercover. I don't like doing it, but I've done it many times. Always my real name. I'm going to I'm going to a store because there's a dispute between two wineries, and they want us to go to a wine store and ask a bunch of questions about the wines, and then see what the person suggests. You're not lying. I've gone undercover at a lumber place, but the whole purpose was that then I was going to write a declaration, be deposed, and be a witness at trial if it went to trial. So there's often you're hired to do some quote undercover work solely to gain information that any public person could go into the front door. If you're trying to, if you knock on someone's door and say, "Hi, I'm with UPS, I have this delivery," that's pretext. But if you knock on someone's door and be like, does Susie live here? You're not pretexting because you're just like, "I'm a PI, blah, blah, blah." So in this case, there's just, he used his real name, he used all his real information. It was not a pretext. It was. But I think there was, I guarantee to get to live in a retirement facility, they had to sign a lot of contracts. I guarantee there was going to be some line items in that contract that you were violating.
Yeah.
by doing this. But that's boring, and that's not Hollywood. We need to keep it sexy and interesting. So that's why. And Ted Danson is such a good actor that it was very enjoyable.
Right. Okay. So Bruce, how about you? How have you used undercovers? How's that come up in your work?
Yeah, I guess in a couple of ways, like on some sort of regular basis, when there is a counterfeit operation and the client needs us to go pretend that we are a buyer of something and go into a store or some kind of place and pretend that we're just there to buy stuff, and then we look at the stuff that we buy and we determine whether it's counterfeit. Um, I've done that where I have pretended to be a grocer going to a distributor of goods, and I although I used my real name, I went in there like everyone just assumed I was a grocer,
Right.
and in a way, I mean, one could say that that was a pretext, but I wasn't really, um, putting myself out there, pretending I was someone else officially. And in another instance, we sent someone to t- uh, take classes in a course that was offered by like one of those Instacart delivery types of services to pretend that they are going to be a delivery person and do all that stuff and then get on the inside of being a delivery person and finding out intel about how that service works and if they were copying the intellectual property of our ultimate client. And they went in with their real names, not pretending to be a certain thing, but they, in the end, they were not really going to be a full-time driver. So in that sort of straddles the line, but it does turn out to be legitimate.
Stephen, there's actually two contexts when you're allowed to go undercover and use pretext. And I just want to highlight these because they're important. I haven't done the legal research in a while because I haven't needed to, but civil rights. So if there is a concern that a landlord is not renting to a certain, to blacks or to minorities or to whatever, to Asian people, and there's a real concern of a violation of civil rights, then you can actually go undercover and pretend to be an applicant for the job or for the residence to see if they're going to rent to, you'd have like different types of races and ethnicities coming in to see what happens. So the other one is a violation of intellectual property. So if there's a concern of a violation of a trademark or a copyright or a patent, and the only way to find out is to go and try and obtain that, or to get access to it, that you need to talk with the lawyer who hired you and make sure you're not, you're coloring in the lines again. But there are carve outs for this. So you can use pretext, fake names, whatnot, to find out if your patent is being infringed upon or whatnot.
I would say also that I agree with Stacey's analysis. Those are sort of two, the courts have ruled very definitively on these issues. Federal court material on this, and then the International Association of Intellectual Property Lawyers has guidance on this issue as well. I actually think another area where I'm comfortable pretexting is a circumstance where the person would give the information to any single person who called, but for the fact that you said I'm a private investigator, and that person is going to get wrapped up in something they don't want to get wrapped up into. So like a perfect example I always give is there was a time that I was trying to find someone who was at the University of Rhode Island or studying at Brown University. And I saw from social media that she had just graduated. Like, it was just luck. Like last week she had gotten her degree, and I thought, I wonder if she's still there. Let me see if I could find out. And I called, I Googled the address, and I saw that there was a rental in the same apartment. And I called the landlord, and I said, I'm calling, and I'm interested about this property, renting it. And he said, it's an all women's house. I'm sorry, I'm only allowed to rent for a woman. And I said, yeah, that's okay. I'm calling, on behalf of a friend of mine. She's traveling. I'm just trying to collect information. How big is the room? Et cetera, et cetera. And then I just said casually, I'm looking at your image on your ad. I think I've been in this house. Didn't so and so used to live there? And he said, oh, yeah, but she moved out last week. Now, this landlord is obviously going to talk to anyone who calls him on the phone and gossip about whatever. And I'm not asking about private, confidential information. The guy's telling anyone. He has the right to tell anyone he wants about that. But if I had called up and said, I'm a private investigator, he would have said, I just don't need to be involved in any of that. But it's not medical information. It's not banking information. It's not confidential information in any kind of way. It's just the only way I can get it is if I don't say I'm a private investigator.
Right. Yeah, and I think that kind of goes to, right, do you have to disclose that, or do you have to, can you just carry on a conversation? And yeah, I don't see, yeah, I think there's definitely lines, and I think the show, this whole premise here, I think definitely probably went way beyond some lines. I think Stacey mentioned contracts. I think there were certain things where, and and I guess especially since I used to be with government myself as a prosecutor. Obviously, there are certain things that happened here that I think would be very problematic for law enforcement to do. There's definitely would be issues with the Fourth Amendment, reasonable expectations of privacy, things like that. But those rules really apply to the government, not necessarily to private investigators.
Stephen, one thing that you see in many courts have looked at this issue over the years in many different types of circumstances. And one of the things that you can see that the courts are really struggling with is they don't care for deception. They don't want deception. And one of the main reasons that private investigators can't do these things is because we are hired mainly by lawyers, and lawyers have their own ethical obligations to be honest and truthful in all of their operations. And so as your agent, I have to uphold those exact same ethical responsibilities. You can't outsource unethical behavior by just saying I've hired someone else to do it. At the same time, the courts have noticed that, well, there is something special about a private investigator that's different than what everyone else does, and that we do sort of expect private investigators to do things that are a little trickier, a little different than what we expect other people to do, and that's what a private investigator historically is. No one would hire private investigators otherwise. And so the courts are constantly trying to figure out, in a way that's it's not really clear, like, okay, where exactly is that line? And to some extent, it depends on the nature. I think it depends on the nature of the information you're trying to obtain, how much advantage you're taking of the person who doesn't know what you're doing. Like, that's why I give this example. The landlord, if I had called anyone who called him, this guy would have told them who it was. But there are other circumstances where you really are taking too much advantage of the person or giving them the impression that you're in a role or a position that is too much and you're asking for too much. And it's not really clear where the line is, I think, in a lot of these circumstances. But I do think it comes down to the type of information and the nature of the relationship that you're trying to insert yourself into.
Yeah. And I think, and obviously, depending on the situation, anyone who's thinking about doing this kind of stuff, probably there are, a lot of times lawyers are involved in helping vet things and making sure that it's okay, especially because the rules might be different in different parts of the country, right? It might vary by state. I do remember, though, I do go back to this myself because the United States Supreme Court did say there's a written decision in 1932 where they recognized that artifice and stratagem can sometimes be employed to catch those engaged in criminal enterprises, and sometimes it is not only permitted, but essential. So I do think there is this general recognition that sometimes you have to do things like this. Now, a lot of what you're talking about here, I think, is more omission, right? You're not necessarily lying, you're just leaving out stuff that, the other person might like to know, but doesn't necessarily need to know. And you don't have an obligation necessarily to tell them. So, okay. So, all right. So again, thinking about this case, okay, let's just, in terms of this particular case, especially now that everyone's seen the whole show, how it actually ended up, right? So just working backwards, just any thoughts on how you would have solved it? How you would have solved it without setting Ted Danson in for 30 months and building up a huge expense budget?
Well, I think that our efforts that we talked about earlier probably might have got to the answer of the covert research, pawn shops, social media, and then identifying former employees. I also think identifying former residents like maybe there's a parent, or I mean a child of the parent who, you know, moved out their parent and then left a really scathing review. I mean, there's so on Yelp or whatever, you know, review platform. So there's so many things that we can do to find people. I think that's, and the last thing is I would just go through the front door. I would go to Dee Dee, who was the boss lady of Pacific View, and say, this is what's happening. And this is what I'm seeing online. Can we talk about it? And, you know, can I come in and help? The other thing is a workplace investigation. If this happened, they would have to do their own investigation internally as well and hire either a PI or an attorney to do the workplace investigation. So there's all these different things that because Pacific View doesn't want theft happening in their you know, their own place. The other, and one last thing, Stephen, the whole recording. California is a one-party state. You cannot audio record private conversations. So you can record if you're out in having drinks, everyone. But if you're having a one-on-one, quiet, private conversation, both parties need to consent to recording. And I remember Ted Danson Carl's had some sort of some recording device. So it's just, that's also big no-no.
The one thing that stuck out in my mind is how the victim of this, the lady who lost her, I recall that she's like not a pleasant woman. You know, she's not. And to somehow like just start with her and find out over the past month, like who have you been in touch with? Like who has actually come into your room? Like that wasn't part of the show. Like there wasn't a lot of interactions with her. But like to really, really sit down with her and find out as much intel as possible and then take it from there. I would have loved to be able to do.
I think the other thing too is like in this case, my recollection from the show is that actually it turned out that the person who had taken the jewelry was just another resident, but she took it not for theft purposes, but because she had Alzheimer's or some form of dementia, and this was just something that she did, right? And like no one really understood. It's actually the kind of outcome that this type of traditional investigation like never would have really uncovered in that traditional way, because there actually really is no real motive and no real theft here at all. But at the same time speaks to something I think that's really important, which is understanding the context of the world that you're operating in and understanding its culture, which is like, this might have been a case where a call to somebody who specializes in matters related to retirement communities, a consultant or someone else really outside the legal framework, that you call, look, I'm doing a case here. We're really having a hard time. Have you ever seen things like this in this world? And that person might have said, well, you know, actually, it's a funny thing that happens sometimes that people who have dementia will start taking things. And understanding that could have actually led to a completely different perspective on the part of the investigator, that actually the problem here is not really a legal theft problem. This is more of a part of a problem in the social world or the medical world at the location, and that you should really be directing your energies in that way. A lot of times I think investigators jump themselves into a case and they don't take a step back and start thinking about, you just have too much of a narrow focus, and you don't take a step back and start thinking about, okay, what's the larger world and context here that might produce alternate explanations. Not everything is just a crime that needs to be investigated.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And especially a lot of the stuff that I deal with is a kind of this white collar world where I see lots of times the initial perspective really can unfortunately shape an investigation or a viewpoint far more than it should. Like, because I've seen cases where, well, if the initial investigator or the government thinks it's a crime at the very beginning, everything they see is going to be through that lens, where it could be, and it might really be just a mistake, a misunderstanding, something that mistakes happen, bad things just happen sometimes, and it needs to be dealt with, but not necessarily through the criminal lens. And that's a big part of what I do, and probably what we all kind of deal with, kind of the differences in that way. So so I think it's really interesting. Like, it does feel like, wow, if they had just talked to Dee Dee at the beginning, probably she would say there haven't been thefts before, but there's been missing things because patients who have Alzheimer's sometimes take things that they shouldn't take, right? And with that alone, that provides a much simpler explanation. right? And sometimes the simple explanation is the proper explanation, as kind of
Mhm.
happened here. Um,
I think what you said, Stephen, about not that the first, often for the client too, it's often the case that the client comes to us and has already got their whole theory of the case based on their own personal prejudices or ideas. And our job is to humor that a little bit, but actually to find out what really happened, because the job is to produce something meaningful and true. And I had a case last year where there was a local country club where somebody had scrawled a swastika over the face of a photo of a Jewish member. Okay. And the board of the club called me and asked me, could you figure out who was the person that committed this anti-Semitic act? And I said, we talked about it. I said, well, what do you think what's this all about? I'm not a member of your club. And they said, well, he's been involved and there's been these disputes over the last 2 years over these club policies, and he's really been strong on this side. And there are some people who are really feel like things have really gone in the wrong direction. And we think maybe it has to do with that. And I interviewed 40 members of the club that we could tell from the records had been at the location at the time, based on the tea times and the bar records and all that type of stuff. And none of that was the reason behind it. Actually, in the end, the person who we believe did it was a frater kid from a local university who was just a guest and just doing a stupid frat bro-y kind of thing. And it had nothing to do with this dispute this guy had over the club policies or whatever. And we would have spun our wheels forever if we hadn't sort of gotten the idea from conversations with other people. Maybe this is the guy who is acting a little buggy over here.
all right. This has been fascinating, and this has been a lot of fun. Why don't we wrap up by can you just talk a little bit about what it's like to actually be a private investigator? Like, what does your day to day look like? Just kind of give a sense of what Julie's day would actually be like when she's not, listening to Ted Danson's, audio recordings and to reports. So just tell us about a little bit what it's like to actually to actually be a PI. Bruce, how about you guys start on this?
Yeah, so briefly, for me, I come from journalism. I used to be a newspaper reporter. I covered the courts and legal affairs. And for me, it's really the same job as being a journalist. What I try to find people who are relevant to my investigation to speak with. I look into the backgrounds of people to understand them as if I'm putting together a narrative, like I'm putting together a story that the client has asked me to put together. Um, it also involves, I'd say, maybe 75% of my time on a computer or on the phone, and maybe 15 to 25% of my time actually sitting down and speaking with another human being. Um, and and then there is also a lot of time that I am spending talking with clients and getting ideas from clients about other people who need investigations. So that's kind of my life as an investigator. Oh, and but I need to mention that no, maybe like 6 times in the past 20 years has a client come into my office and sat down at a desk and been like, all right, Bruce, this is what I need you to do, and here's all the cash to do. It rarely happens.
Okay. All right, Avi.
What I would say about all of this is the thing that stood out for me from this show and some of the email correspondence. Stacy had mentioned Bored to Death, which is sort of an earlier iteration of the show that was done by HBO, I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago with Jason Schwartzman, I think. I think what the show really captures is how fun this job is. It is really fun. We wake up every day like Encyclopedia Brown and just solve mysteries. And there's something like what the great physicist Professor Feynman said. He called it the pleasure of finding things out, which is there is just really something exciting about every day, just taking something from a zero to a one, something you don't know and now you know it. And I think really great investigators are really charged by the excitement of it and are really chasing this Jones, which is what I call the, oh, I got you, you MFer moment, where it all comes together and you're like, I got it. That's what it is. I see now. And if you don't have that drive, you can't get up every day and spend your time trolling through these records and making these random little calls to find that little thing that's going to give you the leverage to get to the next thing. You have to be driven by that to be good, and that's why I think Stacy and Bruce and me have been very successful in this. Is we really love what we do, um, even if we don't have beautiful offices like that lady in that show did. I'd love to have an office like that one in San Francisco.
And Stacy.
Well, a couple things. First, Bruce is correct. Clients don't come to us. The whole premise of the Maltese Falcon, where you go into the private investigator's office with the kind of shaded window, with their name on it, it doesn't happen. Also, just with the everything's changed because I've been doing this for almost 20 years. We used to actually look at phone books. There was a lot more paper cuts involved. A lot more, even being a lawyer. Remember back in the day when we would actually go and look at the books and to shepherdize a case? Everything has changed. Excuse me, it's all online. And yes, picking up the phone and talking to people is golden, but there's no way to know who to call until you actually do the work. So I rely on a team. We also have to bring in our own work. A lot of owning your own firm is being the rainmaker, and I like being a part of professional groups and speaking the golden word. And like Avi said, I love what I do. It is so fun. There are so many scoundrels out there and shysters and cheaters, and that's what we're here to do. I work for the David and the Goliaths, but I really started my own firm because I want to focus more on the Davids of the people who, if you read those books, if you where they use subterfuge and pretexting and following people, with the Harvey Weinstein cases, we're on the other side. We don't take those cases. The three of us have scruples, and we do. If someone calls us and says, "Can you get bank records?" We're going to say no, we can't. Here are the 10 ways that we can try and get that information, but we're not going to break the law. And there are PIs out there who do give us a bad rap. And so we work with people with good scruples who color, like I said, color in the lines. You could be aggressive, you could be creative. But ultimately, when someone asks me, what do I do? I'm like, I'm a New York Times investigative reporter, just like Bruce said. We solve puzzles. And but I also have, luckily, a great team. So I've got the most amazing digital forensics, web forensics, sophisticated investigator who does that. And I've got someone who I don't know how to say it, but puts the person to sleep and gets them to sing. It's I have this team. I can't do it all myself. And so part of it, me, is just kind of providing guidance and feedback and letting them kind of wind them up and say, go and find what we need to find.
All right. Well, this has been fascinating. I really enjoyed hearing from all of you. And yeah, I think this is investigations. Doing a good investigation, I think, is it's a real challenge for a lot of these cases. And just like the show posed a certain challenge about how do you go about solving it, this is what Avi, Stacy, Bruce all do on a regular basis. I do it more from a legal point of view, often working with PIs like them. And it's really, it's a really interesting challenge that for all of us. And so I hope all of you have enjoyed hearing a little bit about how this case would have played out in real life. It would not have been quite as charming and life-affirming as Ted Danson's version, but I think we can still all enjoy the show and hopefully learn a little bit about the reality of this kind of work. So thanks, everyone, and please follow up with any of us if you have questions. Thanks for watching. Thanks.
Bye.